I have a confession to make. I used to be afraid of flying. Hey guys, what's up? My name's Jen. I'm a former flight attendant turned travel agency owner and travel professional. Today, we are debunking flying fears with Airbus Captain Mark. I will first start by saying if talking about aircrafts and emergency situations and that kind of thing really does trigger you, and even though we're going to be watching a video with a captain who explains things really, really well, he's going to be explaining why some of the most common fears that people have when flying are really nothing to be afraid of at all. And I'm going to help dissect them down and maybe even give you guys kind of a view of what a cabin crew, not including the pilots, also have to say about that. And maybe I have some insight on some situations that he brings up. This video is meant to help you. If you are like me and had a fear of flying just because you didn't understand what was going on, or you kind of didn't like the feeling of not having control, what helped me was learning about what is going on with the aircraft and what's happening during that time and how the cabin crew is actually trained. So if you think that's going to help some of your fears, this video is definitely for you. And so let's take a look at what Captain Mark has to say about debunking some of these flying fears. He has some great videos, so make sure to check him out. I'll have his original video down in the description below. And let's get started.
Will the wings break under extreme stress? What happens if a plane is hit by lightning? Can the plane land on water? We'll find out in today's video. Hi everyone, I'm Mark. I'm an Airbus captain for a commercial airline, and you're watching Pilot Explains. And today we're going to go through the most common fears of flying and why you can feel safe on any airliner today.
Let's do it. So let's talk about the wing flex. I'm guessing this is how flexible the wings actually are. And when you guys are in the air, have you ever noticed that the wings kind of like bounce up and down? It's completely normal, and I'm sure he's going to explain why that is completely normal.
The wings moving, completely normal thing. They're designed to do that. When an airline is designed, they design the wings to have a degree of movement in them. Especially for when you're in turbulence, you don't want them rigid. It would stress the aircraft. When you design an airliner, you design the wings to take a maximum amount of load. And then they'll build a jig, they'll put the airliner in it, and they'll bend the wings up until they snap. The current
That's pretty cool. I did not know that, actually. So they're actually extremely flexible.
777 went 150% past its design limit load. Something that would never happen in flight. So you're quite safe. The wings are not going to go anywhere. The new composite wings on the 787, they actually went up 7.8 meters. When you watch them on takeoff, you'll see the wings lift up as the lift generated off the wing. Quite safe. They're not going to fall off.
Is that a common fear that people have when flying, that the wings are going to break and fall off? That is not one that I've heard too frequently, but it does exist out there. Again, as he said, they're so flexible and meant to really even go beyond what their standard is, which is actually really reassuring.
There's many types.
Turbulence is one of my favorite subjects, to be honest.
To turbulence. The one that most people are scared of is clear air turbulence. We're flying along on a nice clear day up at height, and all of a sudden the plane starts shaking and bumping around.
Those are actually going to be the most dangerous as well. It can cause you to kind of like have a drop. It is typically not something that pilots were able to see ahead of time and warn flight attendants to sit down. They're usually like out of nowhere, and that is one of the biggest reasons why you are supposed to keep your seatbelt fastened when you're seated. Even though the seatbelt sign's off, when you're sitting down, keep your seatbelt on, because those can happen at any time and they're not predictable. Those are the most dangerous, and what even flight attendants or cabin crew are not necessarily afraid of, but they don't want to run into that situation. That's why it's very important when the captain does come on and let the flight attendants know that they need to be seated, that they definitely need to be seated. If really bad turbulence occur and the flight attendant is in the aisle of the aircraft, they're supposed to immediately hit the deck, get as low as you can, like low into the ground, and that is supposed to help. It is not great when you have a cart in the aisle. Usually the flight attendant should ask passengers to like help hold it steady. Any coffee, that's going to be dangerous. If you think about it, you hit turbulence and the coffee goes flying. Just a lot of different factors there, but turbulence aren't necessarily a flight attendant's friend unless they are seen ahead of time and the captain lets them know to sit down. So then the flight attendants aren't too sad when they have to sit down and not serve. I'll be honest with that.
You're quite safe. The aircraft is not going to fall out of the sky. It's designed to take it. There's a variety of reasons. It could be a shift in the wind. There's great big tunnels of fast-moving air called jet streams. As you come in and out of those, you get bumps. If you're sitting in it, you can be sitting there with 200-mile wind behind you and it's smooth as silk. But when you leave that, it gets a bit rough. When you're coming into land on a really windy day, especially at Manchester, if the wind's from the north, it's coming over.
Manchester is known to be super windy as well. I've heard many stories. Another thing he didn't quite mention is like the temperature of the air. We noticed that the summer and shoulder seasons, that turbulence are the worst. That's when you'll get more severe turbulence. So I don't know if you guys knew that.
Over the terminal, it's coming over, it's being churned up by all the stuff that's on the ground. That's called mechanical turbulence. It's not very pleasant, but it's not dangerous. We train regularly in simulators in bumpy conditions, and if we're up at height, we have charts that show us where this turbulence will be. We know when we're coming towards it, so we can mitigate things by slowing the aircraft down slightly. It has a special speed to go through bumpy air. We'll know ahead where it's coming because we'll hear people on the radio talking to air traffic control asking, is it bumpy ahead? I'm getting bumps here. I'm at this height. It's bumpy here. So we can descend or we can climb and we can get out of it.
There is an app called My Radar. It was recommended to me by a pilot, actually, and I use it all the time now, especially now that I'm not a part of the pre-flight briefings with the cabin crew. He said that it is a great resource to have. They obviously, pilots have their own tools with the airline and actual meteorologists send them stuff. But he said he always even used it as a backup just because it was so great at registering what turbulence were going on, and it's just a really, really cool app. And I use it to get weather alerts all the time. I always track the hurricanes going on with them. You can see here, it's literally like a radar, and you'll see different zones, like these yellow zones. They're going to be tracking different turbulence, and it actually tells you, speaking of weather, holy cow. I don't know if you guys heard that thunder. Wow. As you can see, we got a weather coming into Orlando right now. It not only tracks the turbulence, and this is just me telling you guys about this. This is not like going to be sponsored by them or anything. It tells you exactly like the height of the turbulence. So from 45,000 feet to 60,000 feet on this one. Let me go across the country. This one is 27,000 feet to 43,000 feet. So, you know, if you're going to be flying in that range, it's going to be pretty bumpy during that. That is a storm going over Green Bay right now. So very, very useful if you're someone that likes to know when there's going to be turbulence. Usually the pilots are really good at letting the passengers know it's going to be bumpy. This. I've had some pilots that are very descriptive. They're going to let you know throughout the flight, like when to actually expect the turbulence. Some are really, really good at it. But if you like really like to know and check for yourself, it's usually pretty accurate. And I have tested it quite a few times. That is a really cool weather app that also gives information about flying. All right, let's continue, Mark.
So it's quite safe. It just feels a bit uncomfortable, really. Some days we're flying around and we know there's thunderstorms around. On our flight plans, they show
thunderstorms look so cool in the air, and when you see them in the distance,
show on the chart where these storms are, so we know when to expect them. We have apps that we can look at before we leave and we can see where they are. When we're in the aircraft, we have a very, very good weather radar system, and it uses a Doppler radar. It sends out a radar from the nose of the aircraft and it picks up large water droplets.
I don't think I knew that it was in the nose. I knew it was somewhere around there, but that's kind of cool.
Get in the cloud, and it bounces back and it paints it on our screen. It comes in different grades. Green is just wet, yellow is getting a little bit nasty, and red, you really want to avoid red. So we can see these storms up ahead, even at night, on our screen. So we know we can turn around and we can go around them. And we negotiate with air traffic control and say, we want to turn left by X amount of degrees and avoid this weather. You've got to clear them at height by at least 20 miles. You've got to be over them by at least 5,000 feet. And you stay well away from them. Occasionally,
at least 5,000 feet. That's interesting to me. I did not know that either.
Craft will get hit by lightning. Most of the time, you don't even know it's happened. Sometimes you'll land and you'll walk around the aircraft on your inspection and you might find a little burn hole. The engineers will come and inspect the aircraft and it's back in the air very, very quickly.
Lightning strikes actually happen way more than people think. And like you said, usually people aren't even going to know that it happens. I've never been on a flight that I was working that had a lightning strike. I've known some people that have had it and some, varying cases of it. Typically, it's not going to do anything. I do know that once an aircraft gets hit by lightning, it is grounded and out of commission until all the checks are done on it before it flies again. Let's hear what else he has to say about it.
Sometimes you get a bit more burning,
Ooh.
but the aircraft is fully shielded against it and the systems aren't affected. All you're going to hear is a little crackle on the radio every time there's a bolt of lightning near you. So we're making an approach to an airport.
That probably gets annoying for them if they're flying around thunderstorms all day, just crackling.
To mitigate this problem, we carry extra fuel. We can sit there and circle in a holding pattern. We can sit there for a significant amount of time and wait for the storms to blow through. If they're too bad, we can go around them. And if they're just not moving, we always have at least one diversion airport that we can divert to that will have good weather and we can get in without any problem whatsoever. If it's a stormy day, we sometimes have 2 or more airports that we can go to where the weather's perfectly acceptable and we won't have a problem landing.
The biggest thing when there's weather is going to be delays. Let's be honest. It's pretty rare for us to have emergency situations, especially in the United States with how great our airlines are. Really, the biggest threat to flying in and around storms is going to be potential delays to your schedule. As you saw, they're very, very well equipped to handle thunderstorms. They want to avoid them as much as possible. If they do need to circle around, fly around, or divert and get more fuel, sometimes that will happen too if they've had to circle and wait for a slow-moving storm to move out.
Some of you guys might be worried. What happens if one of the pilots becomes ill? Well, there's always at least 2 of us in the flight deck. If one of the guys becomes ill, then we'll get the cabin crew in, we'll give them some oxygen if need be, assess their situation. They may recover fine, they may be able to continue with the flight, or they may become what we call incapacitated. So they take no further part in that flight. The cabin crew may give them some oxygen to see if we can bring them round, but if they really can't fly anymore, it's again not a big deal. One of us can land the aircraft, and also the aircraft can land itself in the...
I love how he's so chill about it too. Like, it's not a big deal, but it really is not. They can land the aircrafts alone. There are even more precautions that are taken into making sure that the pilots aren't overly tired or ill. When we would fly internationally, typically on the aircrafts that we had 3 to 4 pilots that were actually working. So they were taking shifts to make sure that they were always refreshed when they were up front. And there are always 2 pilots in the flight deck, usually a captain and then a first officer. When one of them needs to go to the bathroom, only one of them is flying at that time, and a flight attendant will take the place of the pilot that needs to go to the restroom. And that's been in place, since 9/11, having making sure that there's 2 up there at all times and different safety precautions with all that. I mean, we've all heard of the situations where something happens to a pilot and then some random person needs to land the plane and it's a whole thing. But in reality, when you're flying commercial, it's going to be more than when you're chartering planes and flying private and getting into those kind of situations where those situations might happen. Most likely there's at least 4 other pilots on the flight that you're on, trying to either get home or deadhead back to their base or traveling for fun. There's usually someone that can step in if needed. We also, on international flights, had to give the pilots a different meal. If we had fish, beef, chicken, let's say, and a vegetarian option, and there's 4 pilots on board, each one of them, in theory, should each have one of those meals. They also bring food from home a lot of the time too. So just because when you are flight crew, eating the food on the plane gets quite old fast. As he said, there is really nothing to be worried about when it comes to that. Something happens to one pilot, they are more than capable of landing the airplane by themselves. There's stories of flight attendants landing an airplane or passengers having to land an airplane. It would be very, very rare to find yourself in a situation where a flight attendant or a random passenger needed to land the aircraft.
The extremely rare scenario that both of us are taken unwell. Some airlines train their cabin crew how to use the radios. They can call for help. They can be talked down by trained people and set the aircraft up for an automatic landing where it will land, it will stop itself on the runway, and everything will be fine.
That's cool. I did not know that aircrafts could land themselves basically if needed. With Airbuses, I think they're a little bit more like computer operated. That's what I've heard. I don't know if that's 100% true. Obviously, I'm not a pilot. Landing themselves, that's pretty cool. Stopping themselves on the runway, that's really cool. But I am an airplane nerd, so let me know if you guys also find that interesting. As flight attendants, we were never trained on talking over the radio, but when we're up there doing the, bathroom breaks and all of that, you do watch them working on that. I don't know if you mentioned too, there's also oxygen masks in the flight deck that are designated just for them. So they do have separate oxygen with a designated oxygen supply for just the pilots. When it comes to using the radio, the flight attendants were not necessarily trained on it, but up there watching them and just being around it, I feel like it could be figured out. I know there's a lot of different channels and things like that, but maybe they should be fully training the flight attendants on how to use the radio just so they can communicate and whatnot. I can see where that would also lead to probably a road they don't want to go down either. But as he said, extremely rare. I love how he's explaining things.
Again, it's nothing to worry about. It's the same procedure if we have an unwell pilot to an unwell passenger. If they're really not very well, we will divert to the nearest airport. If you're flying around Europe, there's airports everywhere. Very, very easy to get in, very, very easy to get back out. And we try and pick one where we know there's good hospitals. What happens if we hit a bird? Well, again,
strikes.
It's generally a non-event. Depends where it hits on the aircraft. I've had them bounce off the nose before. I've heard them hit the wings. Normally a quick inspection by an engineer once we're on the ground and the aircraft's good to go. If it goes through the engine.
Now, we have heard of United Flight 1549, the Miracle on the Hudson, due to a bird strike in the engine, which I think he is going to get into water landings here soon. Again, so rare for that to happen. As a flight attendant, I don't think I've ever had a bird strike while flying. As a gate agent, I had a little stint as a gate agent. I have seen a pretty gnarly bird strike, but even in that case, it was nothing that the pilots couldn't handle. It actually hit the windshield and the windshield cracked, which is so hard to crack the windshield. It is insane. So that bird, it must have been a big bird. It happened on landing, and the only thing that the pilots were talking about were how the sun was setting. It was like hitting the crack and kind of messing with their sight, but they had things that they were doing as they were landing. It was completely fine. They were just retelling the story, on the ground to all the gate agents, like the heroes they were. And I got to see the windshield, and that thing was cracked. It was really, really interesting to see. But of course, that plane went out of commission and needed to get the windshield repaired. For that to happen, it's so rare. I've seen maybe some like bird strikes where there's some dents on the aircraft's fuselage. Typically, it's a non-event, like he said. You won't even know about it probably 9 times out of 10.
Again, it's normally a non-event. If it goes through the center of the engine, the core, that requires a bit more of an inspection. But if it just goes around the core and through the main blade, again, it's not a problem. If it hits some probes,
he's so nonchalant
does
about
some
it.
Damage to some sensors, they'd have to have a bit more of a look at. But generally, it's not a big problem. I know some people have asked what happens if it hits the windscreen. Well, the windscreens are massively thick, at least 9 layers of glass and heating elements, and they're heated, and they are actually slightly flexible. They've got a little bit of give. So if a bird hits the windscreen has a little bit of give and it bounces off.
That makes the bird strike that I saw extremely rare. I can't believe that it cracked, even though it's that thick. That is actually kind of crazy.
At worst, it might crack the outer layer. You've still got another 8 layers. Quite safe.
Yeah.
We have prevention of wildlife around the airports. There's a guy drives around in a car. He has a flare gun. It makes a loud bang. It scares the birds off. We put all our lights on as we're coming into land and as we take off, and that scares the birds away. Plus the noise of a great big airliner hurtling down the runway gets them out of the way quite well. So the next one is a fire on board. People are very, very worried about this. The first thing we do...
People are very worried about it, and I will say that fire on board is probably the number one thing that you're trying to avoid when in flight. No one wants to experience a fire while on board because it can be potentially one of the most dangerous things that happen. The training for handling fires in different situations with smoke and different types of fires. It's so insane how much training they have to go through, pilots and flight crew. It becomes complete muscle memory if you see a fire. That should be reassuring to you. It's a topic that is always retrained on as well. Flight attendants get trained in the US typically, I think it was roughly about once a year. I think it's a little more than a year, probably like, is it a year and a half-ish, every year and a half. But fires are one thing that is gone over every single time that flight attendant goes in for retraining. It's always talked about, or some sort of topic. It's always part of the training curriculum.
Where the fire is. If it's in the engines, we get an alert in the cockpit. We have fire extinguishers in the engines and we put the fire out. In the tail, we have a little mini engine called an APU, auxiliary power unit. That supplies electrics and air conditioning when we're on the ground, and it can do it in flight as well. Again, that's got a fire extinguisher. We can put that out. The most likely cause we see on flights, we get the smoke alarm in the toilets going off. Someone's gone in there, had a vape, had a cigarette, set the smoke alarm off. We get a load of alarms going off in the flight deck. The cabin crew get a load of alarms, and we have fire extinguishers on board to put it out. Even the toilet bins have built-in fire extinguishers. So we identify where the fire's coming from.
A quick note on that. If you notice that every trash can has a flap on it, and that is to help like keep the fire within the trash. So even down to like the trash flap is checked by the flight crew. It's one of the things that they check on their pre-flight checklist, and the flap has to be in good working order in order for the flight to take off. So it's kind of annoying when you have to delay a whole flight for a trash can flap that might have gotten bent or someone messed with it and it doesn't close all the way or doesn't close properly. The reason for that is that, like you said, there are fire extinguishers in there, and he also talked about smoke detectors go off. Now, when the smoke detectors go off in the labs, it is a smoke detector. It's not a fire detector, smoke detector. So it doesn't necessarily mean fire, which a lot of people always jump to the conclusion like fire instantly, but it's a smoke detector. And what can cause it to go off are any kind of aerosols, like cologne is a huge one. And I'll be honest, Axe body spray set that dang lab smoke detector off so many times. It is insane. And when it comes down to the body spray of like what they used, it was always Axe. I don't know why. There's something with the way that it sprays that is just makes the smoke detectors go off. It was so strange. But even like perfume or any kind of aerosol hairspray stuff, it can cause it to go off. So that does happen kind of frequent, unfortunately, to have people smoking in the lab as well. And then they throw the cigarette down the toilet. The biggest issue when it comes to that is if they were to go throw it into the trash can. There's obviously a bunch of like paper towels in there that could ignite. So it's always just trying to make sure. Of course, the passenger always denies it, and you can smell the weed or smoke or whatever just wafting out of the lab. But the biggest issue is finding out where they threw the cigarette butt or the joint or whatever they had lit, just to make sure that it's not sitting somewhere that it's going to start a fire. So please don't do that, though. That is like the dumbest thing to get arrested on a flight for, smoking in the lab, because you will get caught. Those sensors are very sensitive that even body sprays and perfumes will set it off sometimes. Don't do that, please. But now you know.
And we put it out. One of the new ones that's come out recently is we have new procedures for lithium battery fires. The same batteries that you have in your phones, your laptops and your iPads have
e-cigarettes.
Procedures for that. If we have one of those fires, we generally divert the aircraft and get the offending battery off the aircraft. In the cockpit, there's
the offending battery. I like how you said that. Lithium batteries were also part of the training, the fires that go with them. It's a little bit different process. There's a bag on board that the electronic or device will go into to help cool the device down, dump water into the bag, and they're dealt with a little bit differently just because of the type of fire that it can cause. But usually when those happen, they just really overheat. People have them sitting in the back pockets of the aircraft seats, and then they just heat up while sitting in there and then can start smoking. Mostly what happens is they start smoking. It's pretty rare that I've heard of an actual fire starting from it. but they start smoking, and you just go into the cool down phase and trying to prevent a fire from breaking out with those. So just be conscious of where your electronics are seated. If you feel like an electronic that you have is starting to heat up unnecessarily or just like way too hot, definitely let a flight attendant know, because there are certain procedures that do happen for that, just to avoid either burning yourself. Actually, burns are one of the biggest things too that come out a result of that. I would say the burns from the passengers happen more than a fire actually ending up happening. But yeah, just be careful and conscious about that.
There's two main types that we deal with, and again, every 6 months we train for this in the simulator. We can
Oh,
have
they do
smoke
6
coming
months
off the air
every 6.
conditioning systems, or we can have electrical smoke. There are procedures for that. We isolate the system and we just switch it off. We have fire extinguishers in the flight deck, and like I said, we train for this regularly. So really, there's nothing to worry about. The cabin crew have
He's
special
so
procedures
calming.
on board as well. They have smoke hoods that supply them with oxygen. They have fireproof gloves, and they have their fire extinguishers. Our cabin crew are incredibly highly trained to deal with these fires, and again, they regularly go for training sessions to deal with these onboard fires.
Yep.
The other thing that may happen is on takeoff or landing, if we have an engine fire, we stop the aircraft, we know which direction the wind's coming, and we position the aircraft so the wind blows the flames away from the aircraft. This came about after an incident in Manchester many years ago on a British Air Tour 737. So we park the aircraft, we shut the engines down, the wind is blowing the flames and the smoke away from the fuselage, and the fire crew, if it's after take or before takeoff, they will be there almost immediately. And if we're landing, they'll already be sitting there waiting for us as soon as we land. They'll follow us down the runway, and they'll be there with
Takeoff and landing is going to be the most crucial points of your flight. You can just use that as information that that's when the pilots are the busiest on takeoff and landing, just making sure that everything is going smoothly. When he was referencing the flames blowing away from the fuselage, that is something that is very much talked about. It's a detail that maybe people don't realize that is even thought about or broken down, and there's procedures that follow that. If an emergency evacuation needs to happen, the captain will tell the flight attendants where to evacuate and what doors to use and whatnot, because there's instance, and I don't remember if it was exactly the Manchester flight that he's referring to, but I kind of think it is, where they evacuated into the flames, which is obviously horrific. You want to make sure that you are, if for some crazy reason you find yourself in an emergency evacuation situation, you do want to be listening to your flight crew. You just don't want to open a door and run out. You need to be very, very careful and listen to instructions. That's the biggest thing, is just listen to instructions or where they're pointing and try to just follow their lead, because details like this are very important.
There are special fire trucks that are designed just for aviation fires. And once we've stopped, the fire crews turn up, they'll be
They're so
fighting the
good.
fire. The cabin crew, their main job is to look after you. They'll be getting you off that aircraft as quickly as they can. There'll be cabin crew on
The largest aircrafts that we had could be evacuated in 90 seconds or less. So the goal is 90 seconds or less, get off the plane. I know planes can be evacuated, smaller aircrafts can be evacuated a lot faster than that. It's very surprising how quick you can actually evacuate an airplane if you need to.
on the ground to guide you away from the aircraft, telling you which direction to go, and we'll make sure everyone's off. The captain, unfortunately, is the last one to leave the aircraft, and I have to walk that aircraft and make sure there's no one left. Another big concern is
He does, but the flight attendants also have to too. It's when everyone's out of the aircraft, there is a walkthrough that needs to happen to make sure, as long as they're able to do so, they need to walk through the aircraft and make sure that everybody's out, that they can, and then they need to get out themselves, but they also need to grab certain like survival equipment if needed as they're getting off the aircraft. There's just a few other things that they have to wrap up. Maybe the pilots would get the flight attendants off first and then do their own walkthroughs, but everyone's basically doing a walkthrough at the end there. Loss of cabin pressure. This is another cool one that I think might surprise you guys.
is what happens if the oxygen supply fails or the cabin depressurizes. Well, every single seat in the cabin has an oxygen mask above it. And as soon as
Sometimes they have 2 oxygen masks above it, because you have to account for an infant on board in a mother's or father's lap. There are certain seats that you have to sit in if you have an infant on board, or if you notice that your seat's been changed and you do have an infant on board, that could be the reason why your seat was changed to accommodate for extra oxygen mask in that row. It's different on different aircrafts. I can't exactly remember how the layouts go when you're booking a ticket and you're calling into reservations, or if you're on the flight attendants will know, and it's always marked. If it's something that concerns you, you can always ask as well too.
Cabin goes past 14,000 feet, these masks will drop down. You get the mask and you give it a pull, and pulling it activates an oxygen generator. It's a little chemical block that sits above your seat, and as it slowly burns, it gives off pure oxygen, and you put your mask on and it will give you a positive flow of oxygen for up to 22 minutes. In the flight deck, we will have our oxygen masks on. They're a dedicated supply. We have oxygen tanks for us, and we will be starting what's called an emergency descent, and we will descend the aircraft very quickly. From 35,000 feet, we need to get down to 10,000 feet. In an emergency descent, we can do that in around 4 minutes. So you're not going to run out of oxygen. Around Europe, there's the highest bit of ground we have is Mount Blanc near Geneva. You can be past that in 4 minutes if you're up at height.
Wow.
Another one.
Just adding a little bit more onto that, the most dangerous part of loss of cabin pressure happens is actually the descent, because of how rapid it is, and people are, again, seatbelts are not buckled. So a rapid descent can be dangerous for that if flight attendants are in the aisle and can't get into a position that to brace themselves for that rapid descent. If you do not get an oxygen mask, really what we have been taught happens, it's like hypoxia, where and it's actually one of the signs that there is potential cabin pressure loss. Like you start to lose your coordination and you start to talk kind of funny. Like it's just almost like you're intoxicated and can't quite function right just because of the lack of oxygen. But really, if you're unable to get your oxygen mask on, essentially you'll just pass out and then regain consciousness once you are below that 14,000. Once the aircraft can level out at that point, flight attendants are supposed to walk around with oxygen masks and give extra oxygen to people that need it. If you're in the lav at that point, it's going to be rough because you don't have a seatbelt, but there is an oxygen mask while you're in the lav. Flight attendants are also trained to take oxygen masks from people if they're not near any extra ones. And that is because you want the flight attendants to have consciousness during these types of situations to help keep everyone as safe as possible. It sounds pretty harsh, and when they train us, like there's certain situations that we talk about where there are decisions that have to be made, and there can be harder situations like grabbing an oxygen mask from someone to make sure that you have oxygen. That's not necessarily something that feels really right to do, but it is something that is necessary for the overall well-being of everyone on board if the trained professionals can keep their consciousness. Like I said, worst case scenario that's going to happen is you just pass out and then regain consciousness when you get under 14 feet. And to be honest, that sounds like a lot better time than dealing with the rapid descent, because I can't imagine that that's very pleasant either. I did want to bring up one other thing with this topic though. We've seen a lot of social media videos coming out showing situations with aircrafts where the oxygen masks come down and people are putting the oxygen mask on, and it was shocking to me to see how many people are putting it on incorrectly.
Dramatic images of Marty Martinez and the other passengers wearing oxygen masks have gone worldwide. Notice how the masks are improperly applied. They cover mouths but not noses. That's a big no-no.
You want to make sure it goes over your nose and mouth. That was very interesting to see how many people were wearing them incorrectly.
The one I get asked is, can the aircraft land on water if we have an emergency ditching? Well, it's been proved it can. Sully did it in the Hudson with an Airbus. There was one many years ago in Africa.
I feel like he was kind of bragging about that, like it's been proved it can, but they are made so that they can land on water. That is 100% true. Obviously, he's the one that knows.
The 767 that had been hijacked and ran out of fuel because the hijackers wouldn't let them land. If we have this scenario where we're looking like we may have to land on water, we've already extinguished every single option. We've run through every checklist. We've tried every diversion. We've tried to get engines going. There's different checklists if you have dual engine failure after takeoff or if you have it at height. We have tried everything before we do that. And I've got to say, it's incredibly, incredibly rare it happens. But as we saw on the Hudson, it is possible and it is completely survivable. Every single person walked away. So in conclusion,
before he does his conclusion, one of the biggest things when looking at the evacuation of Flight 1549 was they actually evacuated incorrectly. Amazing, they still all survived, but even evacuating incorrectly, that everything went as smoothly as it did with that flight. From what I have read and seen about it, there was passengers that were sitting at the window, and you really can't blame people for this situation, but this is why, again, it's so important to listen to cabin crew. If, God forbid, you find yourself in that situation, I keep saying like to prep yourself for it, but it's so unlikely, you guys. Listen to the cabin crew, because you're not supposed to evacuate onto the wings when you are in the water, because what that aircraft is going to do, like let's say they were in the ocean, the aircraft is just going to sink and you're just going to sink down with it. Just sitting on the wing is not something you want to do. We want to get the rafts deployed. We want to get the slides out. A lot of the slides are also rafts. And can be used as such. And there's actually tools on the rafts where you can then cut yourself away from the aircraft, because that's what you want to ultimately do, is be on the raft and not attached to the aircraft. They were supposed to have rafts in that situation. Obviously, being in a river, there was people that were able to quickly come get them before the airplane sank down. And of course, that was such an incredible thing to see. We've also seen recent Japan flight being evacuated. Everyone survived and they evacuated under 90 seconds, which is just so amazing what that cabin crew did. So these things are put into place for reasons, and they will really actually save your life. You just need to listen to your cabin crew in those situations. It's so hard though. But yeah, let's see what he has to say in closing statements.
You are incredibly safe in an aircraft. Your odds of dying.
It's safer to be in an aircraft than to drive to the airport. You're 100 times more likely to get in a car accident, not to create a car accident fear, but you're 100 times more likely to get in a car accident on the way to the airport than something happening when you're flying. Just know that it is so safe with the amount of flights. Just look up how many flights are flying over New York right now, and you'll see there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of flights that are going daily without any issues going on. Of course, when something happens, we do hear about it because it is so rare. You're not getting alerted on the media about every great flight that lands. So just keep that in mind, the perspective of what's going on.
In a plane crash is 1 in 11 million. Your odds of dying in a car crash,
that's crazy.
1 in 5,000. The most dangerous part of your day will be driving to that airport.
See?
Flying
he said it.
Is much safer than
I told you. Even Captain Mark says it.
Driving. Right, thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button.
All right, guys, you definitely want to go check out what Captain Mark has to say on his videos. Again, it is going to be in the description down below. There you guys have it, debunking some of the most common fears when it comes to flying. I hope at least one of you found this helpful. I know for me, the more I learned about how aircrafts work and how safe they actually are and all the procedures that go into it, all the training that goes into what the cabin crews do, I became a lot more comfortable flying, and then just out of repetition and then doing it all the time. And then I eventually became a flight attendant. I loved it so much. So there is hope for you out there if you are currently afraid of flying. If you have any other fears that were not covered, please comment them down below. I'm really curious, and maybe I can find another video of a captain debunking that fear for you. That concludes this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you have a bunch of non-stop adventures, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!